Well, we now come to the last session in our course number 3 on poetical and wisdom genre. And in this course, we've been focusing on that aspect of literature from the Bible. And now it's time that you have to put your sermon together. You have to compose it. You have to work on your sermon content document. As you have worked on a sermon content document for epistles and for narrative, you have to do the same for the poetical and wisdom genres, and primarily for poetical in the sense that our focus has been the Psalms and preaching a sermon from the Psalms. But if you take a look at your notes in regards to sermon content for poetical and wisdom genre, and you can also look at the website as well, we start with just a review of the steps. I want to start there because if you look at the steps, it's the same. Nothing has changed in regards to the overall structure of the steps involved in producing a sermon content document. You have an introduction, you have a body, you have a conclusion, and if you take a look at these steps, under the introduction, there's the same 7 steps that are listed as we've had before. Get the attention of the hearer, surface the need, describe the contemporary situation, historical situation, raise some questions that kind of make the listener or hearer be able to think about what the passage is going to be about, read the passage, and then transition to the body. So those steps remain the same. If you look at the body of the sermon content document, it remains the same as well. For each how statement number 1, 2, 3, or no matter how many you have that are in the passage, you need to explain, illustrate, do argumentation, application, and then you transition to the next one. And so I put that lettering scheme in there, and so we've introduced that in the other courses, and so everything remains the same, even with the conclusion. There's 4 main steps there: appeal to the hearer's sense of logic and feelings, summarize the passage, state the action required by the hearers, and make a direct appeal. So all those remain the same. Nothing changes there. So you just need to remember that. And this will be the same for the prophetic. When we get to the prophetic genre, which comes next in course number 4, again, it'll all be the same. And so you just want to remember that. However, since it is a different genre than epistles and narrative, since we do have a different genre from one to the other, you want to realize that there are a few specific areas that when you're walking through the sermon content document, when you're composing that document, that you want to think about. Some things you want to make sure you don't miss. And so I've listed them here under what I call the updated procedure for poetical and wisdom genres. These are a few things that you don't want to miss. Even though all the steps remain the same, there's no changes to any of the steps for composing the document overall, there are a few things that you need to be aware of, what I call some adjustments that you want to be aware of. And so the first one is this: when you're in the introduction section of the sermon content document, and you're in that introduction section, and you're dealing with the historical situation, you got to be able to make sure you summarize the situation as best as possible, as best as you're able to discover it. Now, when we discussed the historical occasion analysis, I told you that sometimes, like especially a psalm, there is a direct historical marker in the psalm itself, maybe in the superscript. And that ties you back to a specific event or series of events that happened in biblical history. For example, the Psalm 3 passage that I've been working on, the one I've been using as the example in the passage or in the course, there's a direct historical marker that ties what David says in Psalm 3 back to the events that transpired between him and his son Absalom. And so when you get to the historical situation, you want to make sure that you do a good job of explaining that. Now, sometimes, like we've said before, the psalm may not have any direct historical marker, no direct historical tie back to a historical time frame. And so if that's not there, you have to kind of deduce what it is from studying the passage itself. You may not know a historical time period of when David wrote those words, or whoever the psalmist may be wrote those words. You may not know the specific time period or exactly when, but at least you can deduce the situation, what they're feeling, what they're going through. Maybe it's a time of despair, a time of discouragement. And so you want to be able to, again, do that well in your historical occasion analysis assignment, but at the same time, when you get to your sermon content document, this is where you will present that to your hearer. And you want to make sure you do it in such a way that it's not boring. You know what I mean? You don't want to just become like a dry theologian or a dry historian. When you're explaining these things, you want to connect them to that event or to that situation or that occasion in the best way possible, because they go through similar type emotions, similar type of experiences. You want to connect them to that. And in course number 5, we're going to talk more about that, how you can be more extemporaneous and connect people, connect your hearers to the passage, especially when you're describing historical background information, historical situation information. So just want you to be aware of that. When you're in the introduction section, just remember when you're in that historical area that you got to focus on making sure that you explain it well and that you do a good job of making sure they understand the framework, the historical situation and framework where this passage lies. Because it will, if you do that well, it opens the door for them not only for you to understand it, right, but for them to understand it. By the time you're preaching a sermon, you should understand the passage already. You should already have a knowledge of what the passage is about. The point is, they need to know. So you have to explain it to them so they can relate, so that they can grasp what you have already learned. So you just want to be aware of that. Number 2 on our list here is when you're going from, after you read the passage, when you're after you read the passage and you go to the transition period, the transition to the body, that's a very important step, especially for poetical genre, because you need to be able to explain the verses in that poetical passage that may not be in your house statements. You'll see this in Psalm 3, for my example. It's verses 1 and 2 are not a part of the how statement. They're part of the setup information. They're actually a part of helping me understand the what and the why. And we make those determinations when we do primary matters. So we've already looked at that. So when I'm going to have to preach that part of the passage, I need to make sure that I go through it well, and that I that I understand that this is the setup information. This is transitional. It leads me to the body. So as I walk through those passages, and I've explained in class what it means to walk through a passage, and we'll talk more about that again in course number 5. When you're walking through a passage, which you have to walk through the entire passage, but when I'm in verses 1 and 2 for Psalm 3, since I know that that's a part of the setup, then in my transition phase of my sermon content document, from transition after the reading of the passage before the body, I want to make sure that I've explained those verses well, so everything runs smoothly to go from the introduction to the body of the sermon. I prepared them to be able to understand what the passage is saying and where the passage is going to take them. The journey that they're about ready to go on in terms of understanding the flow of the text. I got to get them there. I got to get them ready for that. And so the transition to the body is a very important step. Now, you may have a psalm or a passage where every verse in that passage is a part of the how statement. So if that happens, if that's the case for your passage, it doesn't mean that you don't do a transition. You still got to do the transition to the body. But your transition will look differently than if you do have verses in the passage that provide setup information. And your professor, me or whoever's teaching you this course, will help you in regards to that, making sure that when you turn in your sermon content document before you preach, that we're going to read through that. Make sure you're on the right track in terms of the transition to the body area. So just be aware of that. So historical situation in the introduction and the transition to the body in the introduction. You want to be aware of those areas. The final little area adjustment you want to make sure you remember is that when you're explaining, when you're doing the explanation statements for your how statements, you want to do a good job of when you come across a figure of speech. Remember how we did figurative language analysis? You had to identify them and you had to describe them or note what they meant by how they were being used in the passage. You really want to know that real well, and you want to explain that well. You want to make sure your audience knows that. Now, you don't need to use all of the technical terms and say, well, this is a metonymy and this is a synecdoche. You don't really need to say all that every time, because your audience honestly does not even know what those words mean. You can just say, this word is, what it's referring to is blah, blah, blah. What this word is referring to is, and then explain it. You don't need to tell them that you don't even need to tell them it's a figure of speech. You just explain it. And so you want to be aware of that, is that as you're going through poetical passages, you discovered figurative language. You want to make your audience, your hearer, aware of that. But you want to do it in such a way that it doesn't feel like you're lecturing to them or giving them so much technical information that they cannot understand it. Trust me, they will not understand the technical language aspects. I provide those for you in class just as something to help you in terms of the exegesis. What I don't expect is for you to use that same kind of terminology when you're speaking to people who are not able to grasp those kinds of words and terms. So just tell them what it means, what it's referring to, how it's used in the passage. Focus on that when you're beginning to explain those different areas as you walk through your passage, when you're in your body and explaining each of the how statements that are in the text. So just be aware of that, because if you confuse them with technical terms, if you spend so much time talking about the technical aspects and using that terminology, it just more confuses them. And you want them to make this, you want the sermon to be clear for them so that it's easy for them to understand, easy for them to grasp it with their heart and their mind. You don't want them to struggle. And so you may be familiar with those terms, but they're not. So don't use them, because it's not going to be that effective. What's going to be very effective is that you can explain those figures of speech when they appear in terms that they can understand, in terms that they can grasp. Remember, when you're preaching a sermon, your sermon's, yes, you want to honor God with your sermon, but you're preaching to your people. God gave you those people. They're sitting in front of you, and you want to be able to truly help them to understand the passage. So make it clear, make it simple, make it direct, be straightforward. Don't be confusing. Don't use high technical terminology, because the people in your church, the people in your congregation, they don't walk in that world. They don't deal with that primarily. So that's some things you want to think about, some adjustments that you want to make moving forward. So when you look at the bottom of the web page here, or when you look in the notes, you see the example I provide for you of a sermon content document for Psalm 3. And so when you look at that, look at the introduction, the body, the conclusion, look at all the steps. As you can see, this is not a manuscript, right? I've explained this before. Sermon content document is not the same as a manuscript. It's not a word for word everything that I would say. But what the sermon content document does for me, it allows me, and it'll do it for you as well, it'll allow you to have a tool that will prepare you before you walk into the pulpit to preach, before you stand before your people to preach. It's a preparational tool. It helps you to make sure your thoughts are flowing in a more consistent way. It provides for you an efficiency of being able to make sure that you maximize that 45 minutes or so that you're given to preach on a Sunday morning. You want to maximize that time to make sure that what you say is accurate and that it all connects together. So following a pattern like this, it's not even though it seems like it could be a strict structure, it really provides flexibility. It really helps. And so as you look at the sermon content document that I provide for you that as an example, just know that, again, it's not a word-for-word manuscript. Now, in the class times, we're going to spend 2 weeks dealing with sermon content document for poetical genre, wisdom genre. And what we're going to do is I'm going to preach 2 sermons to you. The first sermon I'm going to preach in 1 week, one of those sessions, is from Psalm 3. So you will be able to actually see the sermon content document that goes along with that sermon that I actually preach in class. Now, I'm not going to have my sermon content document in front of me when I'm preaching. I'm just going to have what I need, my Bible and my text and anything I need for that. But I'm not going to have my sermon content document. But you could look at that as I preach, as I walk through. You'll actually fill up the evaluation forms. I put an evaluation form in there. You're actually going to evaluate your professor, okay? If it's me, you're going to hear me preach Psalm 3. If another professor's teaching this course, he may choose a different passage to provide for you as an example. But for me, it's Psalm 3. And so you'll be able to evaluate. You'll be able to hear and see me go through this and kind of get a feel for how to walk through the sermon content document when you're actually preaching it for Psalm 3. But in the first part of that class session, we're going to actually examine the sermon content document for Psalm 3. We're going to look at that. Now, for the second week, second session that we will have for this 2-part thing, I will preach another passage from a psalm, but you don't know what psalm it will be. And it's not one that I'm going to provide you the sermon content document for. So you won't have any advance notice, except when we show up that day for class, I will tell you what I'm going to preach from, what psalm it's going to be from. And again, you will evaluate. So I want you to get that perspective. I want you to get that idea in your mind that what's happening here is that you're hearing 2 sermons, being able to sit in and watch and be a part of 2 sermons from the Psalms. One where you have the example in front of you of the sermon content document where the sermon is based upon. The other one you do not. You will evaluate both. And by evaluating, it forces you to think through each step. Because when you stand in the preaching lab to preach, you're going to be evaluated based on did you follow the steps. So take a look at the example down below, or it's in your notes as well, as you compose your sermon content document upon the psalm that you've been assigned. Then you will be able to make sure you're following those steps. And again, all those steps are described in our first course. So if you need more reminders about what is that step about, what does it mean to raise questions, what was that referring to, go back to course number 1 to the sermon content link there on the website, or go back to your notes and you'll see those definitions given and explanations given at that point. So hopefully this has been helpful. This course has been helpful to you. And so as we bring our video sessions to a close, there's still more that we will do in class, because we'll have our preaching labs for our narrative passages. But as we bring our video sessions to a close, I'm hoping that you have a good framework and a good perspective on what it's going to take for you to be able to preach from the poetical and wisdom genres of Scripture, especially the 5 books of Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and throughout the Bible where poetry shows up. And as we will transition in course 4 to prophetic literature, you will find that poetry shows up there. So we'll be dealing with poetry. We're not going to stop dealing with poetry, but we'll do it in connection with prophetic passages or that prophetic genre, and we'll look at those things in course number 4. So may the Lord bless you as you continue to work, continue to study, and continue to preach God's word to your people.